The summer of 2018 was supposed to be a fresh start. After months of working overtime, my wife Emma and I finally found 3 days to get away from everything. We rented an old cabin hidden beside Blackwater Lake, nearly 5 hours from the nearest city. The listing promised silence, beautiful scenery, and complete privacy. It sounded perfect. The drive took us through winding mountain roads and endless forests. As the sun began to set, we reached a narrow gravel road leading to the cabin. Tall pine trees surrounded the property, their branches blocking most of the fading sunlight. "There it is," Emma said with a smile. The cabin looked charming from the outside. Fresh paint covered the wooden walls and a long porch overlooked the lake. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the orange sky like a giant mirror. One thing immediately stood out. There were no other cabins, no boats, no lights across the lake, nothing. It felt as though we were the only two people left in the world. We unpacked our bags, cooked a simple dinner, and sat outside listening to the wind move through the trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The next morning, we walked down to the lake. Emma skipped stones while I took photographs of the mist floating above the water. "This place doesn't even feel real," she laughed. Around noon, she headed back to the cabin to grab drinks, leaving me sitting alone on the old wooden dock. The silence became almost overwhelming. Then, a scream echoed across the lake. It wasn't an animal. It was unmistakably human. A woman's scream. I jumped to my feet and looked toward the trees on the opposite shore. The sound had come from somewhere deep inside the forest. "Emma!" I shouted. No answer. I ran toward the cabin as fast as I could, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. When I reached the porch, Emma opened the front door with 2 cold bottles of water in her hands. "Why are you running?" she asked. "Didn't you hear that?" "Hear what?" "The scream." She stared at me with genuine confusion. I didn't hear anything. I searched the tree line for several minutes. Nothing moved, no birds, no footsteps, only silence. I convinced myself I had imagined it. That evening, dark clouds rolled over the lake. Rain tapped against the windows while the forest disappeared into darkness. Around midnight, I woke for no reason. The cabin felt strangely cold. I walked downstairs to get a glass of water. As I stood in the kitchen, staring through the large window toward the lake, I heard the scream again. This time it was much closer. It sounded as if someone was standing just beyond the trees outside the cabin. Before I could react, 3 slow knocks echoed across the front door. Knock, knock, knock. Every instinct told me not to answer. Then a quiet woman's voice spoke from the darkness. "Please, let me in." I stood frozen. The voice came again, softer this time. "I know you're awake." The cabin fell silent. Then the doorknob began to turn. The woman in the rain. The doorknob stopped moving. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. My eyes remained fixed on the front door while the voice outside disappeared into the sound of the rain. "Who's there?" I finally called. No answer. I slowly stepped toward the window beside the door and peeked through the narrow gap in the curtain. A woman stood on the porch. She wore a long gray dress soaked by the rain. Her wet black hair covered most of her face, and she stood perfectly still with her head lowered. She wasn't shivering, even though the night had turned freezing cold. Behind me, Emma came downstairs. "What's going on?" I pointed toward the door. "Someone's outside." Emma looked through the window. "I don't see anyone." "What do you mean? She's right there." When I looked again, the porch was empty. The woman had vanished. We searched around the cabin using flashlights, but there wasn't a single footprint in the wet mud. Even the rain couldn't erase footprints that had never existed. Neither of us slept for the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided to ask an old gas station owner about the cabin. The elderly man became strangely quiet when I mentioned Blackwater Lake. "You stayed there?" he asked. I nodded. He sighed. "People avoid that place." "Why?" He looked toward the forest before speaking. 25 years ago, a young woman disappeared near that lake during a storm. Search teams looked for weeks but never found her body. I felt a chill run down my spine. The people who rented that cabin afterward all reported the same thing. What thing? They heard a woman begging to be let inside. I forced a laugh, trying to convince myself it was only an old local legend. But the old man didn't smile. "If you hear knocking again tonight," he leaned closer, "don't answer." We hurried back to the cabin before sunset, determined to leave first thing in the morning. As darkness covered the lake, the forest became unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the lights suddenly went out. The entire cabin fell into darkness. A second later, knock, knock, knock. This time the knocking came from the bedroom window instead of the front door. Emma grabbed my arm so tightly it hurt. Then another knock echoed from the kitchen, another from the back door, another from the living room window. Someone or something was circling the cabin. The voice returned, no longer soft and frightened. It sounded deeper, colder. "You shouldn't have come here." Suddenly, every window of the cabin shook at once. The power returned for a split second. Standing outside every window was the same woman, watching us, smiling. Then the lights went out again. The secret beneath Blackwater Lake. The lights returned only a few seconds later. Every window was empty. The smiling woman was gone. Emma grabbed my hand, her face pale with fear. "We're leaving," she whispered. I didn't argue. We threw our bags into the truck without caring what we left behind. Rain poured from the sky as we started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, but a thick blanket of fog had settled over the narrow road leading away from the lake. I pressed the gas pedal. The truck didn't move. The engine was running, but it felt as if something heavy was holding us in place. Then, knock. A single knock came from the truck bed behind us. Neither of us turned around. Another knock, then another. Slow, patient. Almost as if someone was tapping with their fingertips. Suddenly, the truck lurched forward. I didn't wait another second. We sped down the muddy road, desperate to reach the highway. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was the woman. She wasn't chasing us. She simply watched us disappear into the fog. We reached the nearest town just before sunrise. Exhausted and shaken, we stopped at a small diner. An elderly waitress noticed our frightened expressions and asked where we'd come from. "Blackwater Lake," I replied. The smile vanished from her face. You actually spent the night there? When I nodded, she quietly sat down across from us. My brother was one of the search volunteers 25 years ago, she said. They never found the missing woman, but they did find something strange. What was it? Emma asked. The entire bottom of the lake is covered with abandoned foundations. Long before the lake existed, there was a small village there. It flooded after a dam collapsed. Dozens of people disappeared. A cold shiver ran through me. The locals believe the lake never gave them back. We left town immediately and never returned. Months passed. Life slowly returned to normal. Until one evening, while unpacking a box from the trip, Emma found something wrapped inside one of our towels. It wasn't ours. It was an old silver necklace with a tiny rusted key attached to it. Neither of us had ever seen it before. The moment I picked it up, my phone rang. There was no caller ID. I answered. Silence. Then a familiar whisper. Thank you for bringing me home. The line went dead. I looked at Emma. She had heard it too. The next morning, we drove to the lake one last time. Without saying a word, we walked to the end of the dock and dropped the necklace into the dark water. The ripples spread across the lake. For the first time since arriving there, the air felt warm. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. As we turned to leave, I glanced back one final time. Far out in the middle of the lake stood the woman. She raised one hand in a silent farewell. Then she slowly sank beneath the water. We never saw her again. But even today, whenever heavy rain falls at night, I sometimes wake to the sound of 3 slow knocks on my front door. I never answer, because some doors should never be opened.